Hello and welcome to episode 45 of Fergo and the Freak. I'm that bloke from Rugby League Project, Andrew Ferguson. You can find me on Twitter at AndrewLP. Joining me as always is League Freak, who you can find on Twitter at League Freak. How are you today, mate?
I'm very good. I'm really looking forward to this episode. This might be my favourite episode we've ever done. I already know that.
Yeah, likewise, because joining us today is Associate Professor at Trobe University, neuroscientist Alan Pearce. How are you today, mate?
Hi, yeah, good, thanks.
It's good. Now, yep.
Go on, Andrew. You go.
Okay, I was going to say, today we're going to talk about CTE. It's the big topic at the moment in rugby league. CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Is that pronounced almost correctly?
Yeah, the Americans call it encephalopathy. We tend to call it encephalopathy.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
So we had a report came out recently which said that two players had passed away, had their brains checked, and they found traces of CT in there as a bit of a rough sort of wrap up of what went on there. So at this stage, is it possible to only determine if someone has CTE once they've died and an autopsy has been done? And if so, how far away are we from being able to detect CTE in players while they're still alive?
Okay, yeah. So the first question is yes, only in autopsy can the, I guess you could say that the official diagnosis of CTE can be given. Now, just to put this in light, and we know so much about Alzheimer's disease, for example. Whilst we're very, we're very aware of Alzheimer's and dementias, incidentally, the only true way of diagnosing Alzheimer's is in post-mortem as well. But we're so familiar with Alzheimer's and dementia, when someone does have those symptoms, we're pretty confident that it is Alzheimer's. But essentially, it's the same principle for a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases. It can only be done post-mortem. Now, in America, where they're probably well ahead in the research of CTE than here in Australia, the Boston University group have been trying to answer that question of diagnosing or imaging CTE in living people, and they published a paper last year, I think it was late last year, with some preliminary evidence to show that the way that and we'll talk about a bit more later, the tau formation for CTE is being shown up in a imaging machine. So, but again, it's only preliminary, and there needs to be a lot more work in order for that to be, I guess, validated with the post-mortem before we start to get confident about diagnosing in the living.
Yeah, and so if they're able to image the tau, because I've been reading up on this quite a lot the last few days, if they're able to image that in somebody that's living, would that also have implications for people that have dementia and possibly Alzheimer's as well? Because my understanding is that in CTE cases, it's normally people that are younger, and their brain basically looks like somebody that is a much older person that has dementia. Is that the case?
Yeah, I guess you could say in some respect that it's a form of accelerated aging. So all our brains, obviously with aging, you do get some tau in the brain. It's just part of the aging process. And, and I guess that's sort of how we talk about people sort of having a bit of cognitive decline, getting old and dottery and that sort of stuff, even though that's another conversation again where it may not be true. But generally speaking, yeah, what you're seeing in the brain of someone with CTE is in younger people what you would see in an older person who may go towards Alzheimer's or dementia if they're heading down that pathway. The big difference, though, is how the tau forms in a CTE brain versus someone with a Alzheimer's or dementia brain.
And so what is that difference? Like, obviously that allows there to be a difference in diagnosis between it being somebody that has CTE and dementia. What is the difference in the way that it is formed? Is it formed in different parts of the brain as well?
Yeah, essentially and again, this is still very controversial, but where we're sitting at the moment with CTE is the the presentation of CTE in the early stages versus someone with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. So with CTE in particular, the presentation of the tau protein is very much in the depths of the sulci. So if you look at the brain and you see it's got all the curves, the wedges and the up and down and all the lines, well, basically what that is, they're folds in the brain. And so you have the gyri, which is the top part, and then you see the line. Well, think about that as a fold, and that is called the sulci. Now, at the bottom of the sulci, you have obviously blood vessels and capillaries and whatnot to feed the brain. And what you find is that the tau starts to aggregate around those capillaries of blood vessels. So they call that the perivascular space at the depth of the sulci. How's that for you?
That's very, very good. So my question is, does the tau does it cut off the blood supply, or does it have a physical effect on the brain's ability to pass like the neurons and things like that through the brain? Which way does it work on the brain?
So it affects the actual brain cells. Okay. So the tau itself starts to essentially kill off healthy neurons or brain cells. So that's the thing. So obviously the blood is still, it doesn't affect the actual vascular part of the brain. It's more about affecting the brain cells itself. And why they at the moment, the theoretical or the hypothesis is that it's aggregating around that part of the brain in the initial stages because it's due to head trauma.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah. So if you're thinking about someone being hit, either concussion or even what we call subconcussive hits, sort of big, significant hits that don't lead towards a, concussion symptoms, but certainly someone's taken a good whack, but they get back up and continue to run on or keep playing, and there's apparently no problems. So if you can think about the brain in the sac of fluid that protects it, but also there are very, very tiny little what we call meninges that tether the brain to the skull. Now, if you can think about the gyri on top, sort of having that bit of tethering, but the sulci underneath is free.
It's almost free floating off of, because it's so far off of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that part moves. So what they're thinking in terms of why CTE develops the way it does, and it's still open to quite fierce debate, is that's where a lot of the biomechanical movement is occurring with an impact. And so that's where the tau gets released through some form of damage after the impact.
Okay. Is there any way to find out in somebody that is alive if there are micro tears or something at that level within the brain or even within the capillaries? I mean, is that kind of maybe the direction that doctors are thinking, that maybe the damage is sustained, that it comes from micro tears or something from concussions and just general head knocks?
Yeah, so not necessarily specifically to CTE, but in the United States with some very advanced neuroimaging. So not your normal MRI where you go to the hospital or a imaging place and, you get a scan of your brain or your knee or whatever. That's a magnetic resonance image, and that's normally in black and grey and white. That resolution of those scanners aren't good enough to pick up. But certainly in America, and we've got a couple of places now that have opened up in Australia with some very advanced scanners that we're doing some research, but still way off getting some preliminary data. So can't go down that path at the moment. But certainly in America, what they've found is, as I said, not so much about the actual spots of the parts of the brain that we're thinking about CTE, but deeper in the brain. So you have the grey matter, which is the outside part, and then you have the white matter, which is the deeper part of the brain. Now, the grey matter part is your thinking part of the brain, and it's the doing part of the brain. But the white matter is really important because it connects all the parts of the grey matter together. So think about it like a freeway or a highway, and it's connecting you to different parts of the brain. Now, what they're showing in America, even after one season of football, American football, with no concussions necessarily, is that there is starting to get some damage to the white matter parts of the brain.
Wow.
And so that does affect at various parts of the grey matter being able to communicate to each other effectively. So it can affect some memory or cognitive skills, just stuff that we do every day. It may affect that, and that's just after one season.
Wow, that's absolutely unbelievable. One question I wanted to ask is how much transfer of information is there between the US, where they're really sounds like they're leading this research quite a way, and Australian universities and hospitals and things like that, because it's a little bit surprising to me that there sounds like there's almost independent research going on. I thought it would have been a collective research across the world.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because at the moment the answer really is no.
Wow.
I think it's because America kind of is concerned about their own sports, and they're not necessarily interested in other sports. Now, in saying that, with the brain bank that has just opened up, in Sydney in October, and we opened the Victorian arm about 2 weeks ago. We're part of the global brain bank initiative, which is run out of Boston University. So we are now going to start collaborating with people in Boston, Brazil, Canada, and the UK as well. So we should start to see a bit more, exchange of information, to try and understand what's going on, because concussion and head trauma is not limited by, geographical location. It's not limited by the type of sport that someone plays. It's not limited by the level of sport someone plays. So it's much of an issue at the community and club level as it is at the elite level. And it certainly doesn't, obviously discriminate across gender either.
If you get to a point where you're fairly confident that you've nailed down what's causing CTE, is there anything you can do to help a player while they're still alive deal with the issues? Like maybe not so much a cure, but also maybe a way to reduce the impacts of it, other than stop playing football, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly, you can't just say, well, let's just not play any sort of contact sport, because, and whilst everyone might want to, may not want to play badminton or table tennis, it might be a case that, well, if we don't have people playing sport or doing physical activity that might involve some contact, then what's the flip side of that? And, we've got chronic diseases occurring because of lack of physical activity. We're seeing even now. So it could be a complete disaster if we're not encouraging people to play a sport that they actually enjoy. So we've really got to think about how do we try and mitigate this issue. And at this stage, it's probably, while we understand that CTE is due to repetitive head trauma, it's only a risk factor. So not everyone's going to get it. And generally speaking, the ones who could be at higher risk are the ones who are coming back to play too soon, or who are not letting people know that they've had a knock to the head, with or without symptoms. There's still a lot of cultural problems around that, like admitting that you've been, you've had an impact to the head and you should come off and get assessed. The whole DNA of an athlete, and it doesn't have to be just elite athletes. I work with club athletes, is to play through pain, to play through adversity. So why would I come off if I thought I saw some stars after I got an elbow to the head accidentally? I don't want to let my teammates down. I don't want to be seen as weak. So that's part of the issue, that we've just got to change the culture and the attitude towards this injury, or even subconcussion, and try and get people to understand, look, let's just not take the risk. Let's have a proper assessment. If you need to take some time off, then let's do that, because we could extend playing careers by 4 to 5 years if someone needs to take a break rather than trying to hide the injury.
And how long should players probably take to make sure that they're fully over a concussion and safe to return to contact sport, even contact training, I guess?
Yeah. And that's one of the big questions that we're trying to address. So at the moment, different codes have different times off, and that can be, a good. Well, the consistency is not good, but taking time off, mandatory time off, can be seen as a good thing. But it can also be a catalyst for players to hide their symptoms as well, because they don't want to miss out on that big game coming up the following week, or a preliminary final, or, God forbid, a grand final. So what we really are trying to do, and this is part of my research, is to look at the physiological recovery period after a concussion, because people are very individual. This is a very individual injury. So, you can get two people with a similar impact, and they'll have completely different recoveries, different symptoms, and it's really hard to just give a blanket, one fit all approach to this. So a lot of research is actually trying to understand, can we actually measure people to a point where we know that that person is actually ready to go back and play, rather than having a blanket time off. Now, the other part of it too is that at the moment, all our return to play decisions are based on a clinical assessment, which is fine, which is great. But what we're finding from some of the research is that symptom resolution or recovery doesn't necessarily equal physiological recovery. So what I mean by that is, someone can get a concussion, they can show no symptoms, within 3 or 4 days after their headaches are gone. They can do all their they can answer all the questions and do all that sort of reverse number and reverse months and whatnot quite comfortably. But what we've seen, and this has been shown as well in the United States and Canada, is that when we do some physiological measures, they haven't returned to baseline.
Oh, wow. That's interesting, because that's an issue with the HIA, because that's the only way they can really assess a player, obviously, during a game.
Yes,
and obviously that's something that they're also doing during the week as well. They're not really going too much more in depth than that.
That's right. And so one of the things that is a question relating around that is that we're seeing from American and European studies is that if you are concussed, your risk of injury, musculoskeletal risk, so it could be an ankle, could be a knee, whatever, is increased by 2.5 times if they're not fully recovered.
Wow.
So you might see people who get concussed and then several weeks later they do a knee or they do an ankle. We haven't linked the research yet back to brain physiology or brain processing, but my thinking is that, well, if there's an increase in risk of injury after concussion, maybe it's because that split-second awareness and processing that you've got to do and decision-making is compromised, even by, say, a few hundred milliseconds could be the difference between making a decision to go into that contest or not, and then having an injury.
So would it be wise? I was going to say, would it be wiser then for, like, in the NRL, instead of having a HIA done where a test is done to see if someone's concussed or not, whether it would be smarter to just, if they've had a head knock that's been serious enough to determine a HIA is required, that they just don't come onto the field at all, like they just don't return to the game at all. Would that be smarter?
That's right. Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's right. If in Scotland they use the if in doubt, sit it out, and so if there is still any doubt, then players should just sit out the rest of the game. And that might be a little bit too conservative or a bit too, we're being a bit of a nanny state. But as I said before, we're seeing so many guys, and this is only at the elite level, we're seeing so many guys retire prematurely in absolute, devastated, in tears, that they can't play the sport they love. If we can just instill that, okay, look, we can't take a chance here because this is your brain, then you might still be able to play for another 4 to 5 years. Just by taking that rest of that game out, and just making sure everything is right. Because, brain tissue is not muscle tissue. It's completely different. It's, our brain is such the most important organ, if I can be a bit biased that way. So we need to really look after our brain. And the other part of it too is that we can't see the brain like we can see a corky or a, some sort of swelling of the knee because of ligament damage or whatnot. We can't see that because it's hidden in the noggin. So it's one of those issues that we just need to invest more research, but we also need to be really careful with it.
With the studies that have been done, has there been anything to try and link to see if there are certain people that are genetically predisposed to getting concussions or CTE more than other people, because it seems as though anecdotally there are some players that they get concussions very, very easily, and other players, they can get hit by a truck and they bounce back up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Has there been studies in that area, and if so, like what have they shown? And would it be something that you might be able to do even a DNA test on a player and say, look, you're at a higher risk than your teammates, or even going to somebody and saying contact sport isn't for you?
Well, yeah, so there's two parts to that question. The first part is that they're going down that track in terms of genetics. So we know from boxing studies that there's a particular gene called the ApoE4 gene, which seems to be affected with boxing, but it doesn't seem to be affected with football. And I think the reason for that is because boxing is repetitive, punches to the head, whereas football, you get a fair amount of knocks, but it's not, you're not just hitting the head like they do in boxing.
Yeah.
So, but there are a number of other genes that are starting to get identified, and I think it's going to be more than just obviously one gene, just like anything. That it's going to be a whole what we call panel of genes that may be affected or turn on or turn off as a result of head injuries, and that may explain why certain players seem to struggle to recover or are easier to get concussed than other players. As you said, you can run through a truck and they get up and they keep going. But the bottom line is, again, that is not predictive of or preventative of potential CTE down the track.
Yeah, because they're still getting the same damage. They're just having a different almost reaction to it.
Exactly. So that's probably where that is where the research is going to start to go ahead, but we're very, very early days at the moment in terms of looking at that. There's so many areas of research. It's just ridiculous where we have to go with this. Now with the I guess the screening part, that's a bit of an ethical issue, because if you are screening players who may be more susceptible to concussions or not, and then you say, well, we're not going to pick you, or we're not going to draft you, tell an 18-year-old that you're not going to draft them because you're concerned about their ability to sustain a concussion, is really going to be a whole can of worms. So
it's a slippery slope.
Not really sure where that's going to go as yet. But I think at the moment we're trying to understand why are some people seeming to show signs and symptoms easier than others, despite the fact they may have all got the same sort of similar hit to the head.
Now, in 2011, Sean Valentine, a former NRL player who had to retire from head knocks, it was reported that he was constantly having dizziness, confusion, grogginess, forgetfulness, dry retching. He even revealed that he'd had a seizure once after getting knocked out twice in one game. A neurologist in Sydney said that regarding CTE, that the hard thing at that time was it could have been caused by a number of things like type 2 diabetes, thyroid disease, or a calcium disorder. I was just wondering if in the 8 years since then, have we got better at cancelling out some of those other issues and getting closer to narrowing down that CTE might be more prevalent there?
Well, certainly, I don't know about the CTE part because, we can't determine that until, post-mortem. But certainly, the signs that he was showing were very much around post-concussion syndrome or persistent post-concussion symptoms. So obviously, the seizure after a couple of hits, like he went back on and, that almost defies logic now. But back in 2011, that was still considered normal. And so we, with hindsight or putting 2019 a lens on 2011, we kind of look at that and just think, wow, how did that ever happen? But at that time, there was just no information about there was information, but whether it was used, or taken on board, is debatable. But it's one of those things where when we look at what happened, we can certainly say, well, they were the effects of concussion rather than an endocrine system or disorder or some of the other system disorders that you described in the symptoms. And so, it's certainly, we would be much more confident now that is, what we're seeing was obviously, post-concussion symptoms.
Now, is there anything that if somebody out there, a former player or a former athlete, or just somebody that's unfortunately been the victim of concussions, is if they feel as though they are suffering certain symptoms and they're not really sure if they should see a doctor or anything, obviously the best thing is to see a doctor, but what are some of the symptoms that you see time and time again with people that suffer serious concussions many times, and maybe with CTE patients that stand out? Because there's been certain ones that we've seen mainly from the US in terms of people who have mood swings, impulse control issues. There's drug and alcohol dependence issues. There's the dementia-like symptoms, depression, and the progressive cognitive decline. Are there other things that people can look out for if they've got concerns about that?
I think the first thing is to try, the players need to probably think about their history of head injuries, because most of them who've come into me who've come to see me for the research is that they didn't even put the two things together. So they didn't even realise that they're 20 concussions, or, some of them said, oh, look, I only had 2 or 3 concussions officially, but I think I was really knocked about probably a good 50, 60 times. But a lot of them will go, well, I didn't even think that could actually be why I'm struggling with my mood swings and screaming at my partner or my wife, or not knowing where I put the keys, or forgetting very basic things now where I used to be able to have no problems. And I also thought I was just getting old, but is 48 years of age old, and I'm like, no. So it's trying to recognise that in the first instance in order for them to understand maybe they need to go and see a doctor, or see, go and see, or get a referral from a doctor to see a neurologist, or come in for, obviously to the brain bank for research testing, and can get some information that way. Because one of the other issues, I guess, is that, and it's no disrespect to GPs, but a lot of GPs are not really up to speed on the issues surrounding concussion and post-concussion syndrome and chronic manifestations of repeated head injury. So a lot of them will go and see their doctor, and the doctor might say, oh, look, you're just depressed. And so they'll just give them, they'll just diagnose the depression, rather than maybe looking at, the history and maybe what's leading towards that. So it's, if they have had a career in contact sports, and they have had other people tell them, look, you've never been like this before, what's going on? And we've got to tease it out too, because we don't want to cause paranoia and cause this what we call contagion of paranoia. So because someone gets on television and tells their story, then other players go, oh, maybe that's the same with me, and then we get this sort of knock-on effect. So the idea of the research is to also test them to make sure that they aren't getting anxious and developing symptoms because of the anxiety around the issue, the alarm of what's being generated. So, I've had people, in my lab, and I've probably tested more than 100 elite players now in my research, and not all of them are showing, signs that they thought were in their self-report, and
oh, really?
When you do show them, what I do is, I use some techniques to measure the nervous system and the brain, when you can show them some objective data, like on the computer screen with what I'm actually doing, you can see the relief.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
So, this is the way we have to do the research, because in America, they found 110 of 111 brains of NFL players. Even by Boston's admission, it was a skewed sample. They certainly acknowledge that. So we need to test people irrespective of their concern or not. I have players who go, I had 30 concussions, but I feel fine. I don't think I need to come in for testing. I'm like, you're the person I need to test, because I need to compare you to player X, who's absolutely struggling and can't understand why X, Y, and Z is happening. So I need to compare. It's nice to be able to compare to aged match controls with no history of concussion. So, people who've never played contact sports, but I also need to compare to look at people who have and have apparently no ongoing problems. So that's why we need to recruit as many people as possible to really understand the rates and what what is it. It's certainly not going to be as high as 99%, I can tell you now.
Yeah, and the other thing is too, and this for any players that are listening as well, there's obviously, because there's so much talk about CTE and some of the effects of it, there'll be some players that will be scared to be diagnosed with CTE, even though it can't be diagnosed until postmortems. There's going to be some people that are thinking, I've got CTE, I just don't want to think about it. Whereas they might just have something that they can actually get treated by going and seeing a doctor.
That's right.
So that's really important to let people know that it's worth going and seeing somebody about it. Go and see a specialist, because you might not have any problems at all. It might be something that can be treated.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. So, I guess, being a little bit biased, if there are any, football players, rugby players, irrespective of the standard of play, if you do have any, questions or anything, come and talk to us, and then we can also refer you to, really to doctors who are aware, so that they do have some knowledge behind the issue of concussions and repeated head trauma, so that then they're not necessarily going to see a local doctor who might or may not be up to speed on where we're at. So at least then, come to us first, and then we can help, to our network of practitioners.
And we can put some in our show notes. We can put some contact information as well in our show notes. So we'll do that. If you're listening to this podcast through your podcasting app, we'll have contact information that we'll be able to put there to get in touch. So yeah,
absolutely. And I was going to say, slightly off the direct topic of CTE, how much funding do you think would be required to help further the research into CTE?
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a really good question, because look, just to give it in context, I think, and I know, a kind of scan of where we're at nationally here in Australia on formal research funding from the Australian governments. We have the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council. We've probably got about, various people around Australia, it's probably about $6 or so million of research going into this. If you look at America, they've probably got at least about $100 million going into this research. So you can see the difference. Now, people go, oh, but we're still punching above our weight. And I'm like, well, I in some respects, again, I question that, because when you look at the research that's being published, and I subscribe to a monthly listing of research that's being published around the world, you find that there's probably about 50 to 60 papers a month coming out on concussion. It's a big area. Now, 95 to probably close to 99%, probably about, out of 50 or 60 papers, 55 or 56 will be from America or Canada. You might get one or two from the UK and Europe, and then we might get one paper out of Australia every second month. So we're well behind in terms of where we're at. And I guess, if you look at, the last week's report on the CTE cases, just coming out in Australia, whereas, the first report was 2005 from Bennett Omalu. So this is how far behind we are, and we need much, much more research funding into it. Now, I don't think that it's necessarily, the responsibility of the national sporting organisations. They have a really big job to do in promoting the sport and sport entertainment and all that sort of stuff. They're not a research institute. So as much as we probably would appreciate their support, we need to get funding from the government, but we also need to get funding from philanthropists who love their sport. If they are able to, provide some tax exempt donations, help their tax bill, with all the stuff with ScoMo and all that, that would certainly help our research. And the other thing too is that we need to have the research independent. So there's no questions about people going, oh, well, they found this result because so-and-so funded them from that sport or anything like that. We've got to make sure that the research is done independently. So, if there's anyone listening out there who is wanting to help how small, how large, it doesn't matter. Helping us to be able to do the research independently is the key to this.
Absolutely. And I was just going to say, I suppose the other thing that you'd need too is a cross-section of athletes from different codes. So it's probably a good idea too for all of the sporting codes in Australia, especially the football codes, to be united in this front, I guess, to try and help each other out, because the head knocks that you're going to get in AFL are going to be much different to the ones you get in the league, because it's just different sports. They're they're running around everywhere. It's more...
Yeah. Well, I guess this is why it's so important that we do get players from all codes and even other contact sports like lacrosse or hockey or ice hockey and that sort of stuff. Because, as I said before, a concussion doesn't discriminate on what type of hit in what sport. It doesn't matter what level you play at. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter your gender. So we need to get everyone to unite to look at this and get it done properly without, fear or favour, because we need to answer these questions.
Well, this has been an incredible interview. I think you've answered pretty much all of our questions that we had. And
I can talk about this all day,
Mate, so could we. We know you're a bit strapped for time, but so could we. We would love to have you back on sometime in the near future, because this is a really important part of sport in Australia. And I think that it's fantastic that after some of the horrible things that we've seen in US sports over probably the last 20 years and going back further than that in Australia we're kind of getting on the front foot a little bit, so that we don't get to the levels that they hit with some of their former athletes before we decide that it's time to look into this and make sure that we're looking after our sportsmen and women.
Absolutely. We've got a really good opportunity here to get it right and not make any of the same mistakes and be really responsible about it. And, by addressing this front on, we will be able to look after player health and welfare, and it will benefit the sport. It's not anything to do against the sport. It's to actually benefit the sport and benefit the people who are playing it.
Yep, definitely. And that's really important, because I think that it's very easy for people that enjoy sport to get very defensive about things. But at the end of the day, what this whole thing is about, it's about looking after and protecting our own people, the people that love this sport as much as anyone, and that's the players, that's the people that participate, and they're the ones from all the way from the 5-year-old that starts playing footy for the first time right up to, the old bloke that's still running around in the country at 45.
That's right, exactly.
Well, that's been absolutely splendid interview, mate. Thanks for popping in today.
Not a problem. I'm happy to come back anytime. So absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
We'll definitely get you back, that's for sure. We'll have all the contacts for Alan and in the episode description. Freaky's going to put those up. So